All right, let's talk about the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is essentially a boundary, and it really is what defines the cell. It has a variety of functions besides keeping everything inside the cell. It plays a very important role in what we call cell signaling, which means that there are parts of the plasma membrane or the cell membrane that are important for detecting chemical signals from other cells or uh, sending out chemical signals and allowing for communication to occur between cells. It also plays an important role in immune responses. And really important, it plays a big role in transport processes, which there will be a whole separate video on these transport processes. So transport processes would be the different mechanisms that are used by the cell to get things into and out of the cell. One of the things that we can say about cells is that, or the cell membrane, is that it is what we call a selectively permeable membrane. Permeability refers to the ability of something to move through something else. And when we talk about the plasma membrane and saying that it is selectively permeable, essentially what we're saying is that the plasma membrane can choose or select what it wants to come into and out of the cell. Now obviously it doesn't consciously do it. It selects it based on the chemical and physical properties of the molecules. And that's something we'll address a little more directly when we talk about the specific transport processes. All right, well, let's take a look at membrane structure. So what is that plasma membrane made of? Well, first of all, we say that this plasma membrane is what we call a bilayer. And essentially it's made up of two layers of lipids. And these are very specialized lipids, which I addressed before. These are called phospholipids. And if you recall, a phospholipid consists of a glycerol and two fatty acid chains. And this is a bilayer because the amphiphilic nature of these phospholipids, because these fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, and the majority of the cell is an extracellular fluid is water, what happens is that these phospholipids orient themselves in such a way so that these tails are away from the water and the hydrophilic heads are towards the water. And as a result of that, it creates this bilayer. And you can see those phospholipids here, all these little things, these little yellowish circles, those are the heads of the phospholipids. So here you go. Here's those fatty acid tails, and you can see that orientation. So what we're going to find in the center of this phospholipid membrane is essentially a very oily interior because it's made of those fatty acid chains. And because of this orientation of these phospholipids, this is what allows certain things to actually pass directly through the membrane or not. Things that are fat soluble are able to very easily pass through the plasma membrane because they can pass through this fatty interior. Things that are water soluble do not pass so easily through that plasma membrane. They actually need to use various transport mechanisms. Now, when we look at the plasma membrane, if we go back and take a look at the plasma membrane as a whole again, the majority of that plasma membrane is 98% lipids. And this includes mainly phospholipids. That is the majority of that 98% is those phospholipids. But we also have some other lipids. We have cholesterol in there. Remember I talked about that as a lipid. And cholesterol is important because it actually adds stability to that plasma membrane. kind of holds things together. Otherwise, this plasma membrane would be very, very soupy and would break apart very, very easily. So this adds some rigidity to that plasma membrane. We also have some lipids called glycolipids. And these glycolipids are phospholipids, which include a carbohydrate chain attached to them. And you can see one right here. So here's a phospholipid, but attached to it is this carbohydrate chain. And these are very important for what we call cell identity. In other words, these are important for allowing your own immune system to recognize that your cells belong to you and not another organism. And therefore, your immune system will not attack your own cells. When we talk about autoimmune disorder, if you've heard of autoimmune disorders, that is where the immune system is attacking your own cells for whatever reason. And so there may be an issue with the glycolipids and this cellular identity function that's causing that immune system to actually affect that identification process. Now, there's also associated with the plasma membrane proteins. We talked about proteins before in Chapter 2. If you need to go back and review those proteins. And we have several different classifications of proteins that are part of the plasma membrane. We have what we call transmembranal proteins, meaning that these membranes span through the plasma membrane. They connect both the extracellular fluid and the intracellular fluid. That protein actually penetrates and actually moves through and is embedded in that phospholipid bilayer and is connected to both the extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid. And you can see some examples here. This one, this one, this one. If we go back to the previous slide, we can see that this here is one of those. This one here as well. And this ion channel is also a protein, and that is actually something we'll address later, but that's also a transmembranal protein. So transmembranal protein is one of those proteins that is actually transcends through that plasma membrane. We also have what we call peripheral proteins. And these peripheral proteins are found on one side of the plasma membrane or the other. Some of these would include what we call anchoring proteins that help to anchor membrane proteins to the cytoskeleton. These cytoskeletal proteins that are important in the structured stability of the cell are transmembranal proteins. If we go back to this other slide here, they don't really show them, but you can also have proteins that are associated directly with the surface that do not go through transmembrane. They're not transmembrane proteins. And the other type of protein are what we call glycoproteins. And these glycoproteins would be proteins that actually have a carbohydrate chain attached to them, hence the term glyco, meaning sugar. And these also are going to play a role in cellular identity and communication as well. A lot of these are kind of acting as receptors and things of that nature. All right, so if we look a little more closely at these different proteins, we can find that they play a variety of different roles. If we take a look at them, some of these can act as receptors. And what these transmembranal receptor proteins are going to be doing is they are actually going to be finding chemicals in the extracellular fluid. Those chemicals will bind to this receptor, and when it binds to that receptor, that protein then will actually trigger response by the cell. Some proteins act as enzymes. We discussed that back in Chapter 2 when we talked about proteins. They are important for breaking down chemicals and molecules. If we look at the digestive system, there are enzymes embedded within the plasma membrane that are important for breaking down food molecules in the digestive tract into smaller parts so that they can get absorbed. We also have channel proteins, and these channel proteins are proteins that are constantly open, and these will allow things to actually then, that are not fat soluble, that are actually not, as I said, not fat soluble, but they will allow these molecules to actually pass through the cell membrane into the cell or out of the cell. We also have what we call gated channels. These gated channels are, again, channel proteins, but these open and close in response to certain molecules and open and close at certain times to let things into and out of the cell. Mentioned before, cellular identity. So we have those phospholipids and those glycoproteins that play a role in cell identity. And then we have what we call cell adhesion molecules. And most cells in the body are very, very closely packed together. And we have transmembranal proteins that are physically linking these cells together and essentially creating this tissue then where all these cells are very closely packed together. And allowing them to stay adhered to one another. And these are important because these actually help in certain types of tissues to provide some protection for these tissues and for these cells so that they don't actually pull apart during subjection to various forces that may tear them apart.